We are doing number 2 on Trafford, Pennsylvania, where we will see how Trafford got its name, and we will see the town built there by George Westinghouse. This was a town that Westinghouse built for the people who worked in his factory. George Westinghouse had a factory not very far away from Stewart Station, which he became aware of, and he was very interested in expanding his factory at East Pittsburgh. He needed more space, and the area up at Stewart Station became interesting to him. And I call this the second chapter because this is where Trafford gets its actual name. I just want to show you the land designations here. I put this red line here to show the difference between Westmoreland County over here and Allegheny County over here. This is Trafford. And right over in this area, you can see East Pittsburgh in the area where Westinghouse had his original factory before he started expanding. That is George Westinghouse. Westinghouse was a very bright fellow, even though Carnegie may have thought he wasn't a very good businessman. He was actually a very good engineer and a smart guy who did a lot of stuff. And he had one of his enterprises over in England at a place called Trafford Park. So when he built an extension or a new factory in this country, he named it after the place in England. He called it Trafford City. This is the property he bought up by Stewart Station. This was Stewart Station right here. This was where the railroad was going through, the original main line of the Pennsylvania Railroad. And in the early 1900s, in 1902, Westinghouse sent his people out to buy a good bit of property. This was about 550 acres. And then he sent the guys out to survey it, lay it out as a town. This was the original Trafford. This was the railroad going through. This was the original Stewart Station down here. This area up here, though part of the borough of the original Trafford, was not laid out in streets because this was where Westinghouse wanted to build his factory. This is what Westinghouse had built. This was his original plant. There was a foundry, a pattern shop, a powerhouse. We might have to enlarge this a little bit. This is what happened inside of a foundry. This was a furnace, hot metal, hot iron from the furnace was poured. You can see the iron pouring into a one of the devices that hold the molten metal, molten iron, to pour it into the molds. This is the process. This underground here, under the floor, was one of the molds. This is one of those ladles that held molten metal. Another one over here is another one. These two ladles are pouring the molten iron into the mold to make a casting. This is the pattern shop in the factory that Westinghouse put together. The factory's pattern shop is a place to make the molds for the patterns for the molds where the hot iron would be poured in. This huge thing on this railroad car was one of the very big castings that was made at Westinghouse's Foundry. That thing is really huge. I never knew they made castings that big. That is a monster as far as castings go. Now this is a shot of Westinghouse's new factory. Foundry over here, the pattern shop, the powerhouse. These old gray photos are sometimes uninteresting and hard to look at. What I did was I worked it up a little bit, firming up some of the linear stuff and put color on it. It makes it a bit more interesting to look at and harder to understand. Actually easier to understand, excuse me. This was the actual foundry over here where hot metal was poured into molds. This was the pattern shop that made the the things that they used to make the patterns, the molds from. This over here was the powerhouse. Over on this side of the powerhouse were furnaces where they made steam. And this side of the powerhouse, that steam was put into steam engines that turned what they called dynamos. We would call them generators because they generated electricity. Now this down here is the area we were talking about, and right up 5th Street where it hit Cabot is one of Westinghouse's buildings in his new town. This was, he called it Trafford Inn. He kept that English motif of inn. The bottom floor of it was a commercial site, which became a bank. The upper floors were available for people who worked at the factory and wanted to rent independent rooms. He realized that not everybody who worked at his factory had a family and they might not need a whole lot of space. This is a 1925 mapping, Sanborn fire insurance mapping, showing what we are looking at. This is the original foundry. This is the pattern shop. This is the powerhouse over here. This is 5th Street coming up where it hits Cabot. This is the hotel or the bank building that we will see. The next thing we'll see will be an enlargement of this area right here. This is the building that was the hotel or bank building. In 1925, there was a movie in Trafford. This was the movie building. Up here was the railroad station, and we're going to see that. That's the railroad station. One of them. There were several railroad stations at Trafford. That's another view of it, North Trafford Station. This is the Turtle Creek branch of the railroad that took off from Trafford. And North Trafford was 4/10 of a mile up from the main line. 1.2 miles up the main line was the Blackburn station. Here we see one of Westinghouse's operations. This was called the Micarta plant, which was built at Trafford in 1929. It made a synthetic material that was figured out by Westinghouse engineers. was used for airplane propellers, pulleys, and other uses. The micarta process was better known later as Formica. This up here was the original micarta plant, and it was placed elsewhere, shipped out, and the plant was enlarged, and the space here was used for what was called switchgear. Westinghouse's switchgear division had a thing called the power circuit breaker division that originally occupied these buildings. That is one of Westinghouse's power circuit breakers. If you don't know what a 500 kilovolt breaker is, that is a circuit breaker that deals with 500,000 volts of electricity. That is a lot of power, something not to be messed with. Now here we see from the air the things we were talking about. Up here we're looking at the power circuit breaker division. Down here is what remains of Westinghouse's original factories. You can see a space that has been cleaned out. That was the original foundries down here. The only thing remaining is the powerhouse. And I think maybe at this point we've said enough, and we're going to switch over and push a button and switch this down. Bye now.